Good morning, gentlemen. Wonderful weather. I thought I'd have a word with you about NATO. NATO is one of the biggest organizations, military alliances in world history. But I'm afraid it's an organization that rivals the Axis in terms of destructive power. And I have no hesitation saying that NATO is the most destructive alliance in world history, much bigger than the Axis alliance, the Pact of Steel, which was between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Because in this alliance, there are over 30 nations, but of course, the dominant force is the Americans, that the United States. Now, NATO, as you all know, came into being in 1949. That was the time when President Truman was the head of the American state, and he decided that they needed an alliance to counter Stalin. That was the purpose. And certain, I think about 10, 11 countries led by France, Italy, and England, Spain, they decided to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that is called NATO. It was a defensive measure against the Soviet Union, which was at that time rampant to spread communism over the world. But that's about all it ended, because there was then the rise of the Soviet Union under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and then the collapse. And in 1990, I think there was a meeting between Gorbachev and the American Secretary of State, if I remember, his name was Baker, and he assured Gorbachev, who was the Russian president at that time, that NATO would not expand an inch eastward. Again, once the Soviet Union collapsed, Boris Yeltsin, who was the president, made an application to join NATO, which the West, at the time Clinton was president, he very cleverly sidestepped because they had deeper plans. And the deeper plan was to perpetuate the hegemony of the American state through NATO, make NATO as an instrument. So in that respect, NATO is one of the most destructive alliances in world history. And despite the solemn promise to the Soviet Union earlier, and Russia being denied a membership on the ground that it's not required, and don't worry, we're going to look after you, NATO began to expand eastwards. And after 1977, all the countries of Eastern Europe became part of NATO except Ukraine and Belarus. This created an essentialist threat to the existence of the Russian state, and no Russian could agree that this was something not devious. It was a very, very devious meeting. And NATO had further plans. They wanted to break Russia into a further 3 or 4 countries, so that this Russia is finished for the next 100 years, and the Americans and the Anglo-Saxon powers can rule the roost forever. Well, there would still be China, but then they thought we'll deal with China later. So NATO, gentlemen, was an organization which is actually contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. Now let me enlighten the listeners that when the United Nations was formed in 1945, the Charter says that there will never be any oppression, any subterfuge, and freedom of the world will be guaranteed. But this is exactly what NATO has been doing. NATO has subjugated a lot of countries, and NATO has gone and removed Gaddafi and made Libya into a desert wasteland. They got Saddam Hussein hanged and created an extensive crisis in Iraq. They lost in Afghanistan, NATO, though it was basically an American fight, but there were NATO forces there, and left everything in the lurch when they ran away like rats running away from a ship. They lost in Vietnam, that the Americans, they couldn't win in Korea. So there are so many things which happen. And confining us to NATO, NATO in the last charter has talked about China also. That means it's now becoming not a European alliance, but a global alliance. And NATO's got associate membership to so many countries. They would like India also, but I think Mr. Modi is a little wise and he shouldn't fall into the trap of NATO. NATO is basically an instrument of oppression. If you remember, the 18th and the 19th century, right up to the middle of the 20th century, was the age of imperialism. when the British and the French and other European powers had colonized the entire world. But then everything collapsed within 2 years of the end of the World War, after Adolf Hitler lost and the Western Allies, particularly England, won a Pyrrhic victory. It was so Pyrrhic that the British lost the entire empire within 2 years. It was all over. Go home. So now the situation is that NATO had to rebuild from that edifice, and Truman started in 1949. Initially, it was a counter to the Soviet Union, but now it has become a counter to the entire world and an instrument for the hegemony of the Americans over the world. Will they succeed? I don't think so. Because everything's got a lifespan. Even the nuclei has got a lifespan of 50 years. It dies away. So a lifespan is always there. I think NATO's lifespan is over. They have incorporated countries like Estonia, Latvia, Poland. We get no consequence, absolutely no military power, nothing. And the next conflagration, which is bound to take place between NATO and Russia, supported by China, these countries are going to be history. They won't exist. And after all, Nikita Khrushchev had made that famous threat to England also, and England should also beware, because England is in serious problem. They are headed by an Indian, and even Scotland is headed by a Pakistani. And Scotland, once it breaks away from England, England will be nothing but a rump. And they'll become like a state of the Americans. America's got over, I think, about 51 or 52 states. England will become one of those states. That's the only way England can survive. And they left Europe, as you all know, the EU, because they could not tolerate Germany being the supranational power, the superpower in Europe, in the continent. The situation is now really becoming weird. In the Second World War, the German tanks were fighting the Russian tanks in Ukraine. That's a fact. And some of the biggest tank battles took place there. And the irony is that the same German tanks, the same government tanks, are now going to battle the Russians in Ukraine, because Germany has given some Leopard tanks to the Ukrainians. England is giving them the F-16s. I think it all sounds very well thinking. This is called brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is you think that other thing may not happen. But every day, as you know, is not Sunday, and so many things happen which you don't expect. And the Russians are getting ready for a long drawn conflict. As I told you already, the city of Bakhmut has fallen and the Russians are going to move forward. Massive attacks with the latest weaponry are being launched in Ukraine. And Ukraine are being given weapons like the F-16 and all that, but they've got no infrastructure, no training, and they're as good as throwing the weapons into an abyss, because they not have been used to the Ukrainians. And Ukraine has already lost the war. 25% of the population is a refugee in Europe. The country is destroyed. And the man who brought it about is Zelensky, and he's strutting around the world thinking that he's a great man, which unfortunately only the mirror can show. It's only the mirror which shows you how you look. And Zelensky must look in the mirror and see how he looks. I don't think he believes in it. All I know is that his name was featured in the Panama Papers, and he's got property stacked away in the Leeward Islands, London and all that, and he's enjoying himself. If something happens in Ukraine, he'll run away from there, say bye-bye. The Americans and the Biden are playing with fire. They are bolstering NATO, thinking NATO is going to be the alliance of the 22nd century. It's not going to happen. Just watch. Just within 2 years, I can give a forecast, NATO is going to collapse. It's going to collapse, and because they have bitten off more they can chew. They tried their level best in Iraq, got Saddam Hussein hanged on the first tree available, and by a farcical trial, they got Gaddafi shot dead, hanged. I mean, you name it, you name anything. They even 1954, way back, they put the Shah of Iran in power in Tehran, thanks to the CIA. They got Allende, who was elected democratically in Italy, shot dead right in his office. They got Che Guevara killed after he had surrendered. You don't kill a man who surrendered, but they did it. It's at the instigation of the CIA and the Americans. America is now the great Saturn. I have no doubt in my mind about it. And it's about time the world woke up to it. And India should really beware of the Americans. They never back you. Remember that. The way they ran away from Afghanistan is something which is sickening, really. Left weapons worth over $100 million for the Afghans, left their spotters behind, many of who were executed, and they just said bye bye and just ran away. And that is why it's called the mother of all retreats. They are bungled up in Libya, persona non grata there, Iraq. No American walked the streets of Baghdad alone. But despite this, they are bolstering NATO, because NATO, they're really not bothered what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, or something like that. They're not bothered. They're bothered in American hegemony over the world. And as I've said, NATO is the most destructive organization which has been set up in the world for the last 200 years, much ahead of anything which Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini, etc., which is called the famous Pact of Steel. Yeah, man, it's about 100 times more than that. How will NATO collapse? Naturally, people will ask me, Commander, tell us how it's going to collapse. Well, it collapsed from the battle in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are going to lose. And that is the time the Americans will have greater escalation, more forces there, more weapons, and that will be the end of Europe. End because the Russians are not fools. And I have had a very reliable source telling me that watch now, by September, October, certain countries in Europe are going to suffer very terribly, particularly the small ones like Denmark, Belgium, Latvia, Estonia, and Hungary. All these small countries, Poland, they're going to be devastated. If a nuclear explosion takes place in Ukraine, the dust clouds are going to go over these countries, and that will bring radioactive material all over their populations. I don't think these people realized what it means to play with a tiger or a bear which is in an angry mood. I wish they knew it, and they were realistic. They are still living in past glory, in particular the British, who still feel they are part of the great British Empire. This is over. The empire is dead. They should bother about their own home now and try to save Great Britain from breaking up, which is going to break up. They should think about the monarchy. People in England, at least 35 to 40%, don't want the monarchy now. Thousands of people are saying King Charles is not our king. And Biden, of course, is too old. And he's senile. And that is the drawback for America. I don't think Trump is better. Trump is an equally useless person, that's the word I can use. He didn't do anything in 4 years and went and lost the election. I think all the scandals around him do not qualify him to become the president of America. Then who's going to come? That means there's a positive leadership. There's nobody on the line in America who can take over. Someone like Roosevelt. Roosevelt died in 1945, and that's about all. And now 78 years have elapsed. So many presidents came, went away, but not one matched the caliber of Roosevelt. And that is precisely what's happening now. Gentlemen, NATO is on its last legs, mark my words. And I would like you to save this video, think about it, because I will give you some other forecasts which are based on astrology in one of my next videos, and I will tell you which are the countries which are going to be destroyed by the month of September, October. So keep watching, men, friends, look at it. In the meanwhile, I'll say bye-bye. Jai Hind, glory to India. Do look after yourself, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, share it with your friend, and come back for more. Goodbye and God bless.